Welcome back to Pop Goes the 60s. I'm Matt Williamson, and today we're going to review the Beatles Anthology. And that entire project was quite an undertaking and one of the biggest projects the Beatles have ever undertook. And I thought it was time to give it kind of an overview, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately. Just did a review on the documentary The Complete Beatles, so I thought it would make sense to follow that up with this. This came out in 1995. And included over 5,000 hours of production and prep to get this rolling. And I'll give you a little background on the project itself and on the pieces you see here. But it came out on the 19th of November. I remember that well because I happened to just leave the country and I missed it. And it was 6 hours long. And this was accompanied by the new single, Free as a Bird. So there was a lot leading up to this. This was the first project the Beatles did together, really, since they broke up. And there was a lot of acrimony in the 80s and a lot of issues. And once EMI Capital settled a dispute with the Beatles, that freed up them. I mean, there's a lot of bad blood between EMI Capital and the Beatles, and once that was figured out, it had to do with money. That was settled in 1989. That basically paved the way for this project. More on that in a moment. Let's just talk about the pieces of this, because those of you who are a little younger may not realize when this came out, it was incredibly well timed. I mean, we as Beatle fans had not really had anything of substance, I think, really since the Complete Beatles documentary from '82. There was some sporadic releases here and there, but not including the solo material. So what came out was this set of CDs, three double sets of CDs, and they came out in order. The first one came out November of '95 to coincide with the documentary that aired on ABC. The second part came out with the second single, that was Real Love, that came out in March of '96, and the final one came out in October of '96. This was supposed to have a new song on it, but they couldn't get it together. So these had all these obscure songs, stuff that you could only get via bootleg before. Some of the stuff was not even available on bootlegs, but very good quality and really filled in some gaps and took you through some of the process of the recording with some choice early cuts in here. The main one being In Spite of All the Danger, one of the earliest recordings on here, which I believe is from 1957, 58, right in there. So some very early stuff. So the music that was released on here, including the two new songs, was a huge deal. And when this was released on day one, it sold 450,000 copies. So it was almost gold on day one. And I think it was number one on the charts as well. Now, that's kind of strange because this is really not, 450,000 people, I mean, there's a lot of Beatle fans, more Beatle fans then than there are now. This is 30 years ago. So a lot of us bought this, but it was not the entry point for a casual fan. A lot of casual fans bought this because of the hype. This was incredibly hyped. So before I continue and talk about more of the pieces here, the artwork here, the painting that you see was done by Klaus Voormann. And just to give you a better look at the painting, the full painting, this is what it looked like. And Klaus was the guy who did the Revolver cover. So that very horizontal design was used to cover for the three covers here. And then what I really like is the back of all these things is basically a piece of canvas wrapped around a wooden frame. So the art direction for this is done by Rick Ward. He did an excellent job. So this whole project, which has many parts to it, was really made special by some very fine art direction, and that was Richard Ward. So, okay, let's put the music aside for a moment. Oh, before I do pass it up, we do have the singles that came out. So we have Free as a Bird, Real Love, and no single for the third one. And these were very different covers, different jewel cases, actually. This is the thin jewel case. This is a regular jewel case. I thought this was better, but this continued the motif of the back. Not so much here. Not sure why. That's the only inconsistency pretty much in the packaging, but it's not that important. So anyway, that is the music side of it. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Then in March of 1996, the VHS of the documentary was released. and the laser discs. Now this I picked up much later when laser discs were not in vogue anymore. Were they ever in vogue? But these are, I mean, talk about heavy, but very cool. And you've got the Apple label on all these as if it's an album. So it's just very slick. Those of you who don't know what laser discs look like, it's like a huge DVD. So this was 8 discs, just like 8 tapes for the VHS copy. And I don't know what it retailed for. I didn't get the VHS copy either. I wanted it, but it just didn't happen. And it turned out to be okay. I had a friend of mine record it on television for me because I was out of the country. So that helped tide me over until I got the DVD set. This didn't come out until 2003. So this was an expanded version. This was 10 hours, and it had an additional disc with 81 minutes of behind-the-scenes stuff. So this is the one I had waited for this, and I'm glad I did, because this is what I ended up getting. Now, I did jump the gun a little bit there. That was 2003, but in 2000 is when the anthology book came out. I'll talk about the documentary in a moment, but I think moment for moment, this book packs the most punch. This has way more than the documentary. Essentially, this is a collection of all the pertinent Beatles interviews strung together and told that tells the story. It's old interviews, it's contemporary interviews, and it's done very well. The book has it's just great photography, great artwork. It does show some memorabilia, but nothing that's not important. Like, for example, it's got the poster of the Village Fete that John and Paul had met on, stuff like this. Can't see it too well here, but suffice it to say, this book, it's got a ton of stuff in it and totally worth having on the shelf. Not just to have on the shelf, but to go through it. I mean, I've read it through twice, and I refer back to it all the time, and there's always things I want to refer to. And just to refer to the different eras of their career, it's easy to get through and easy to find that stuff, the stuff that you need. So highly recommend the book. All right. So the background on this whole project really goes back to the Beatles' breakup. And they broke up, as we all know, in 1970. And at that point, Alan Klein was their manager for the most part. That meant that Neil Aspinall didn't have as much to do. So he's kind of backing up Klein and doing little things for the Beatles. But his main job became working on this documentary, which at the time was called The Long and Winding Road. And he started to compile news footage, newsreels, gathering as much stuff as he could for something that was going to be the Beatles on film, a documentary of some sorts. So this was worked on for quite a long time, but they actually had a rough cut of it in 1971. And this was 90 minutes long. So I just did a documentary, or a review on the documentary, The Complete Beatles. That's kind of how I envision The Long and Winding Road to be, something on par with that, about the same length, lots of old footage and things like that. We know that there was a rough cut put together because George Harrison showed it to Eric Idle. Eric Idle was in the Ruddles, and they did the All You Need Is Cash mockumentary, which is a very funny parody of the Beatles. So there was something out there, but it wasn't ready for a release, or at least it was just in rough form anyway. So as I alluded to earlier, the 1980s was a very difficult time for the remaining band members in the wake of John Lennon's death. There was there was acrimony, business affairs, and there was sporadic solo things going on of various successes and failures. So by 1988, things were still rocky enough that Paul McCartney didn't go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremonies. So George and Ringo were there with Yoko, and that kind of showed that things weren't going that well. But a year later, things that were settled with EMI and Capitol, and they were able to get past some of that. Now, this project was still not in the works. This was indefinitely on hold. And the fact that the Beatles had settled some business differences did not put this back in motion. What happened was George Harrison had some very bad business dealings, and he found himself short of cash. What happened with Harrison was he after the Beatles, the three Beatles had dumped Klein in the 70s, George Harrison started working with Dennis O'Brien, who became his manager. And when George Harrison got more involved with Handmade Films, his film company, the way it was set up was that O'Brien only was a 50% of the investor, but he got 50% of the profits from this company. The problem was that the George Harrison took 100% of the risk. So Harrison was on the hook for all the risk, and O'Brien wasn't. And this is one of the things that Harrison did not know, and this is one of the reasons why he failed as a businessman in many ways. This is one big oversight. So he carried all the risk. So when Handmade Films started going down the tubes, Harrison was stuck with the bills. So he sued O'Brien. O'Brien declares bankruptcy. Harrison's not going to get the $11 million he's suing him for. So Harrison, realizing, well, hey, I like this cushy lifestyle, all of a sudden he was not very nice to Paul McCartney through the 80s. All of a sudden he's like, hey, buddy, what about that Long and Winding Road thing we used to work on? So that's how this thing got back on track. So there was several years of planning for this, and the first interviews were started in 1992, 3 years before this was released. And by 1993, there was a rough cut. So those of you that are familiar with this documentary, there's lots of new interviews with the likes of George Martin, Derek Taylor, Neil Aspinall. Aspinall was not interviewed for the complete Beatles, which is a shame because that would have probably been extremely valuable. So in the remaining three Beatles are also interviewed, and archival video is used for John Lennon's contributions here. So the original cut had way more interviews, and what they ended up doing was they cut a lot of that out and inserted more band performances, promo films, things like that. And by this time, the Beatles, since this is authorized, they had access to the best quality material. So this stuff looked wonderful. So this ended up being a 10-hour documentary that at the time was just wonderful. In 1995, like I said earlier, there weren't a lot of big projects on the Beatles. This was like the biggest project really since the breakup. And everybody was excited about it. And I would say for its time, it was perfect. However, all these years later, 30 years on, there's a datedness to it. And it's not as reliable as one would think as a documentary, as the story of the Beatles. And I'll get into that in a moment. Now, the first thing that was changed for this project was the working title, which had been The Long and Winding Road, which I always thought was a working title in and of itself. But that name always stuck. But apparently, from what I understand, George Harrison, who was a little salty through this whole period, was not really enthralled with having a Paul McCartney song be the title of the project. So they came up with another working title until they could come up with the real title, and that was called the Beatles Anthology. Well, that ended up sticking, so that's the title of this project. Now, I mentioned we had longtime close associates involved in this being interviewed, but only a couple. Derek Taylor, George Martin, Neil Aspinall, that's pretty much it. Yoko Ono, she's not interviewed in this. She was one of the people that helped put this together, but she basically stood down and was not interviewed for this. Now, as this project got going, Yoko Ono had supplied the group with an old John Lennon tape of a demo, and that's what they built the song Free as a Bird around. And that became kind of the focal point, I guess, as this thing was approaching release, was the new song. So Yoko's contribution was that, and there were other songs on there that they were free to use if they liked. And that became one of the main things and things that people got excited about. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, this is a bit dated, and part of the reason it's dated is because we have some better information about the band inner workings and some of the things that actually happened. So what you had here was 4 entities that were trying to balance things out as much as possible. They all had their story to tell, and they were walking on eggshells with one another. And that made for some very bad compromises that compromised the story and didn't really give the story lost some balls, in other words, let's put it that way. Now, one of the things in this compromise I keep mentioning is people, by this time in the 90s, they had worked with guys that they trusted and everybody wanted to bring their guy in. Well, this didn't happen. George Martin wasn't the producer of the new stuff. They brought in Jeff Lynne. Jeff Lynne was a George Harrison guy. Lynne had been producing Harrison and other acts around this time. One of the people Paul McCartney brought in was Jeff Emmerich. Emmerich was one of Paul's guys, as was Mark Lewison. So George, by this time, had fallen out with Mark Lewison, but Paul got him through. Richard Ward was the art director. That was one of George's guys. So you see this, they built a pretty good team, but it wasn't maybe the best team. And that's some of the compromises that I was talking about. And I don't know what this would have sounded like had George Martin done the production over Jeff Lynne. It might have made sense to have Martin do it, but maybe it didn't. I don't know, but we got what we got. Now, Mark Lewison being on, he did many of the early interviews for this, and he has stated publicly that there was friction between Paul and George during this project. The bickering that we are told of going on between George and Paul, I think really affected the final result. And it's easier to see now with some hindsight and some distance between the project and today. Now, overall, this is an extremely satisfying documentary. And I don't know that we could have expected it to be more balanced or less biased. Maybe that's too much to expect, because generally speaking, everything here is good. I would say this is more ear and eye candy than anything, because what we're treated to is a lot of wonderful footage. And then they recreated like room sets and had memorabilia in there. They really did a wonderful job of tying this all together. So from an art direction standpoint and a direction standpoint, it's really nice. Where this thing falls apart a little bit has to do with the three principal guys telling the story. And it's generally told pretty well up through the 67, because that's through Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour. Come 68, which is basically when the breakup starts happening, this is where they start pulling punches and they start walking around on eggshells a little bit. That makes this whole story less satisfying. One of the most important parts of this documentary was something that the Beatles and the people putting this together probably didn't realize they were doing, but there's a humorous part where the Beatles all remember something differently. And in this event, it was the creation of All You Need Is Love, the song. Was it created specifically for the Our World broadcast? Was it laying around for a while? They show every Beatle giving a different answer. And George Martin kind of even not chipping in an answer, just not knowing. And this was, I thought, the most humorous part of the whole film. And I like the fact that they included this. But I think that they unknowingly showed exactly what this documentary is giving us. In the instance where we don't get the answer to the question, what was the genesis of that song? Was it written for the broadcast? We don't get the answer for that because there's no agreement from the three principals. I think that's kind of a microcosm for this whole project. And I think they unknowingly showed their hand and gave us a little tip. It's like, well, this is not to be taken too seriously, because in some cases we just don't have the answers, even with the principals offering their best memory. I would say the whole early part of their lives is told really well. The Beatlemania period is done really well. There's a couple myths put to bed. One being that John Lennon thought they were selling out, getting into suits. Well, really that's dispelled by Paul and George. So, hey, to get paid, if we could get paid more, we would have wore anything, So that was some revisionism by John Lennon, I believe. So everything, I would say, the Beatlemania stuff is a lot of fun, and there's energy in when they talk about the memories of that time. And then there's also some energy when they, obviously the 1966 World Tour, that was a very difficult time. They go into that, and then the whole Pepper period. The drug taking with LSD is gone into pretty thoroughly. But I would say that this idea of 60s music, and as we reflect on 60s music, the idea of hallucinogenics in conjunction with creation of music has been romanticized. And we see that a little bit here as well. Now, we get into the later drug taking, we don't hear much about that. So by 1968 in this documentary is when things start to, the context I think is pretty good when they start talking about Apple. There's no way to sugarcoat the disaster that was Apple, the company they created in 1968. No way to sugarcoat it at all. There's nothing good anybody has to say about it. It was embarrassing. So that part I thought was pretty good. But even the problem is that the Beatles, it was so convoluted, I don't think they even understood what Apple was. You really have to read Peter Doggett's book, You Never Give Me Your Money, to get the full feeling. I don't think the Beatles had any clue what all the intricacies of that. They were just blown through money. So that is told fairly well. But the thing that gets short shrift is the breakup. I would also say Yoko Ono's presence that was, something to be dealt with. That was something that John brought into the band that wasn't there before. And he basically shifted his allegiance to her over the band. I think that's a pretty fair statement. And there was some adjustment for them to deal with that. And that just added to the whole breakup scenario, really. So because this breakup of the Beatles have never talked about it much. It's just too big for them to really talk about. And it really needs to be told by somebody from outside. That's why I mentioned Peter Doggett's book. That's a wonderful, it's a book. It takes a book to understand it. But I think that's the best way. How do you sum this up? And one of the problems with this documentary is the Beatles, there's too much subjectivity from them that they can't really do it justice. One of the things that Mark Lewison has said, having been part of this whole process, was he was able to eavesdrop on a conversation Paul had just after they saw the final cut of this. Now, the Beatles, the individual three guys, Ringo, George, Paul, they weren't really conferring with one another on whatever rough cuts they were seeing. But there was a final cut that they got to see all together. And when the breakup time came, they got to hear which each other said about it. And Paul said that was really rough to go through. So there's unfinished business between these guys. There was, at least at this time. And it just made for a difficult end to the project for them. There was problems between George and Paul particularly that they couldn't overcome at that time. And unfortunately, they seem to be at a loss for words when they try to sum up what the Beatles were in the end. So you've got this documentary, which is great up until the 68 part where it starts to stumble, where nobody really wants to say what happened. And they're whether they're embarrassed, they don't understand it. It's just, it's a failure. And this is one of the things that makes the end of this kind of end with a thud. And it's a little bit boring, and it's not uplifting, well, until you get to the launch of the new single, which is Free as a Bird. But that hour and a half leading up to that is really kind of like, whoa, this is kind of crashing and burning here. And let me explain why. So the way they wrap this up, we have quotes, and we have audio quotes from John here. John said, for example, "We've been through the mill for more than 10 years. We've been through our therapy to get it together many times." So he's talking about the difficulty of the breakup. Ringo said, there were still good days. Instead of working every day, the Magic worked about 2 days per month. There were still good days. Still, we were really close as friends. Then would split off again into some madness. George, it got to the point where it was stifling us. There was too much restriction. It had to self-destruct. Then Paul gives the good account of Klein trying to pressure him to signing this contract. And he's like, I'm not signing this. And Klein is trying to buffalo him. Friday night, I got my board has to see it. He's bullshitting McCartney. McCartney wasn't having it. So that part is in there. Then it gets to the part that doesn't really, I was a little disappointed with. It doesn't really talk about Abbey Road as being the breakup album. Everybody kind of assumes it's Let It Be, but it's really Abbey Road. All this difficult business stuff was going on during Abbey Road. And they were able to leave the business stuff in the business room, in the boardroom, and come to the studio and record and kind of leave that out of it, which I give him a lot of credit for. George had said, once we did Abbey Road, we accepted that it was over. Now we know this is not really true. This is kind of a hindsight. This is how they're kind of trying to wrap things up here for the documentary. Ringo said, we had really caring moments between four people, four guys that really loved each other. So Ringo's he's doing his best to put the best spin on this. And it's nice, but I don't know how sincere it really is. George says they gave their money and their screams. The Beatles gave their nervous systems. Then Paul finishes up by saying, his part anyway, by saying, I'm really glad most of the songs dealt with love, peace, understanding. There's hardly anyone that says, go on, kids, tell them to sod off, leave your parents. So McCartney really is struggling here to come up with some kind of closing meaning to the Beatles breakup. And that was probably the worst of the quotes. And I'm disappointed they even used that, but I guess they had to use something from Paul. But I mean, this is not easy to end. You can't even put a good spin on the Beatles end. You can't do it. Lennon says, so we leave it to Lennon. It's not a great disaster. You have all the old records there if you want to reminisce. So, I mean, that's about the best that could be said. So that's how this whole thing ends. And I remember loving it and being so thrilled to have this great, huge, long documentary to digest. But really, the way it closed up was difficult. So then imagine you got all these quotes, and then you cut to the three remaining Beatles in a room, kind of talking about, well, we thought we couldn't do it again, but just so happens, we've got this track, and we're the Beatles again. And then they cut to the Free as the Bird video. So that little intro leading into that was a bit awkward as well. Not very well done, as Paul nervously is chewing on his nails after saying that, So it reeked of amateurishness, that part of it anyway. So we see this elaborate video that launches Free as a Bird, and it's not unlike what happened with Now and Then in 2023, where there's this elaborate, nostalgic video to go with the song. The music part of it was probably the thing I was most interested in. I shouldn't say that. I mean, I was a bootleg collector at the time, so all of this stuff was kind of a big deal to me. I kind of thought, oh, well, now we won't need to buy bootlegs anymore. It's all right here. Boy, was I wrong about that. This is just a drop in the bucket, really. And there were other songs that didn't make it into this documentary or into these compilations. And George Martin had, unfortunately for him, he was put in the middle of the three guys. And he's like, hey guys, this is the time to open up your vaults and bring to the table what you got that wasn't released. Now, this was not easy because these guys were not really getting along. There was stuff being said like, well, I'll give one if he gives one, but if he gives one, I won't give two, or something like that. It sounded very petty. So there was the one song that was not released in this, which was Carnival of Light, which is not a song really. It's a January 1967 kind of sound collage that was used at I think at the 14-hour Technicolor Dream, some happening at the Roundhouse in London. And it's not really a song, but all four Beatles participate. And I think it was in the track listing to be on Volume 2 here. And it got nixed at the last moment. I think this was a Harrison thing, that it wasn't really, it's the avant-garde stuff. Harrison, I don't think was a big fan of that stuff, but it seemed to me a little bit of a dig at McCartney. To this day, it's not been released. It was not released on the Sgt. Pepper box set, which would have been the next logical place for it to be. There is a third logical place for it to be, but we don't know if that'll see the light of day. Other recordings, there was a 30-second snippet of the song You're My World. That was found on a tape that was mislabeled. The song It's For You, there's a small part of that. There's an acoustic version with John and Paul of Love of the Loved that's different than the Decca recordings. I think that's with just John and Paul. Another thing that had been recorded, if you can believe it, were the Litherton Town Hall shows. That was in 1960. Somebody actually recorded those, but those have been lost. But can you imagine hearing that? That would have been wonderful. So we have Grow Old With Me along with Now and Then. Those were two songs they didn't deem good enough to work on. And we know what happened with one. Grow Old With Me is just a demo of Lennon's. It's still around. There's a reason I suppose he didn't release that one either. Didn't sound very Beatle-y. Now, one of the things I found interesting with regard to all the tracks used for this is Mark Lewison also said, he made a comment once. He said, well, we don't know what Paul's got, suggesting that Paul had his other stuff in the vault that he didn't bring forth for this. And one of those songs might be the original song, the original produced version of Step Inside Love. There's an acetate available that's in horrible quality. It's been around forever. And I would love to know where that original is. So that version has never been found in any better quality that I've ever heard, and it was played on a Kenny Everett radio show, I think in early '68, but it's not logged in any EMI library or anything, so nobody knows where it was done. It might be a Paul home demo, not sure. Now, the other song that was reported that the Beatles were working on was a brand new song written by George and Paul called All for Love. Now, we know this because it was intended to probably be the new track for Volume 3 of the anthology. And they worked on the song, and let me just give you the history here. Written by Harrison and McCartney, known only as All for Love. This was to be the third single. This information comes mostly from Peter Hodgson, neighbors of McCartney's family. So through this whole anthology process, Paul was going back to old friends who had some tape recorders of early tape Beatles stuff. This is pre-fame Beatles stuff. And this is Peter Hodgson, had some old tapes of them. That's what wound up on some of this early stuff, some of this 1960s stuff. So he was interviewed and said that the Beatles were working on this song called All for Love. And it was in no way confused with the song Real Love. So Hodgson knew what he was talking about, that it was a separate song. So the other information came from Rip Rensi, who's an award-winning reporter. He may have got this off somebody who was working in the studio off the record. He said there was a third straight day of recording All for Love. Paul and George had a disagreement about a musical or a lyric section. Rowd argued with Harrison storming out of the studio saying, "That's it, no more new Beatles." So that's what we have on that song. And man, that's the one I'd love to hear. Even if it's unfinished, it'd be kind of cool to hear what those guys were cooking up together, you know? If the ending of this wasn't uplifting enough, in 1996, Apple actually made an official statement. Harrison made a really strange statement saying there'll never be another Beatles reunion again. This is where it ends. It was just didn't need to be said at all. So I think that prompted some official word to come from Apple, which said the end has finally arrived. The Beatles are no more. The official word is that Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr will never play together again as a group, and that they have decided that there will be no more singles issued from their back catalog. 1996 that was. So why would they even say that? Just say nothing. Obviously they released something in 2023. So all this ended very badly. And I think what happened was, you know, this was basically, the anthology project is basically what we came to know as the new Apple Corps, the new business operations of the Beatles known as Apple. Because prior to this, it was all kind of loosey-goosey. They didn't even have the actual control of this logo until like 1994. I mean, they had to get their shit together and really recreate the corporation and the brand that is Apple and the Beatles. And this was the start of that. And it got off to a very rocky start in terms of how the players, Ringo, Paul, and George, were working with one another. And they were bickering a little bit publicly, which is, I find, unprofessional and hurtful to the fans. And then I think it was when Linda McCartney got ill. And then they're like, okay, whoa, wait a minute. We're going to just keep all this private. And that's when they started to behave, or Harrison started to behave a little bit better, at least publicly, at least by maybe not saying anything at all negative about McCartney. Because I think she died in 90, was it 96? I think it was. So that kind of brought that to an end. And to this day, we haven't really heard any negative things said about any of them, really. So they kept it to themselves if there was anything to be said. And unfortunately, it took the death of a spouse to kind of, I think, make that start to happen, or think of the whole Beatle thing in a different way. Because us fans, we still love the Beatles. So we were looking for light at the end of the tunnel. And this was the end of the tunnel, really, where a door kind of closed. I think it's worth noting how big this was and how popular this was. So this, as I said, this first volume sold 450,000 copies in the first day. It was over 500,000 in the first week. All of these sold in I don't know if they were all gold, but they sold in huge numbers. Just to give you an idea of the viewership in the United States anyway of this documentary, when it first aired in November of 1995, it got 27 million people watched it. 27.3. That's 17 million households. Just to put that in perspective, at the time, the biggest show on television in the States was the show Friends. They were getting 30 million viewers per episode, average. This is how big this was. It was almost watched as watched as the most popular show on television. And if you compare that with Peter Jackson's Get Back, which was aired narrowcast on Disney Plus, Get Back did not crack the top 10 on Disney Plus's programming for that first week. That gives you an idea of how big the drop-off is of Beatle fans that we've lost in 30 years. So I think that's worth mentioning, because I think that the Beatles are becoming more and more of a niche as the people that lived during their time start to die off. Now there's talk about re-releasing this. In fact, the Beatles are already pre-selling the re-release of this book here. And with all the things that they could release, I just don't see this as being a priority. I think what's going on here, and this is a guess, but having done Now and Then 2 years ago, I think they may feel the need to bring Free as a Bird and Real Love up to that quality. In other words, remix it so it's got better vocals from John Lennon. What a lot of people don't know, this was already done. This was done on the, what is it called? I was going to bring that down. The Beatles 1 Plus promo videos box set. So those songs were refurbished for that. And that already came out slightly before this technology all took a major jump. And there are other fans that have redone Free as a Bird and Real Love better than Apple has done so far. So I don't know that there's a need to do that. It seems to me that could have been done when they slapped Now and Then on the Blue album, on the 67 through 70 compilation. I mean, you could have put the other songs on there as well. That kind of would have made some sense, I guess. Well, not to me, but I mean, to Apple, I don't know, to somebody. But anyway, they are going to be re-releasing this book, and it makes no sense at all to release this book. This book is not in demand at all. If you go on eBay, you can get this for so cheap. It's basically, this is over £6. Do you know how much it costs to send a £6 book in the mail via media mail? The prices on eBay right now, it's basically you're getting the book for free, and you're paying about $10 to ship it. That's how not in demand this book is. So I don't understand why they're coming out with a new version of it. People do not buy it, just get the old one for pennies on the dollar. Same thing for all this stuff, all these CDs. You know, maybe they'll add a fourth volume of this. I don't know. There's certainly enough where they could. I don't think any of this really needs any remixing. That would be ridiculous, unless you're going to do Free as a Bird and Real Love, I suppose. Other than that, no point. to remix a demo or to refurbish a demo. This, I have not heard of anything being re-released. Maybe this would be streaming. There's a director's cut with more interviews. I guess they could maybe bump this up to 11 or 12 hours. I don't know. I don't know that that's worth it either. Would anybody buy it? Some would. It would not, I don't think, be a big seller, because I think already at 10 hours, this is pushing the limits of, I think, people's patience, actually, particularly new fans. That's why I said in my last video, The Complete Beatles was a better entry point for new fans, because it's under 2 hours. It tells the whole story very well. In some cases, better than this. What else have we got? Well, I guess it'll come out on vinyl again. I never saw the point of buying any of this on vinyl. I know some people are vinyl addicts, and some of like myself, I'm in recovery. I don't need to get the vinyl anymore, but I can see how they would maybe be able to sell some of those. But overall, I don't see why they would be doing this project at all when all of this can be got very affordably. Now, all of this is being talked about and supposedly getting release dates in 2025. Meanwhile, what everybody has been asking for 3 years has been the Rubber Soul box set, and that's apparently not coming. But, we just had, I didn't do a video on this, but I did see the Beatles in mono. That box set was re-released. But for some strange reason, the pre-orders are out of stock, like in the first number of hours. How can pre-orders be out of stock? Don't you take the pre-orders and then do a print run based on the pre-orders? I mean, this is, ladies and gentlemen, this is a company that has no CEO. Jeff Jones left in 2024 in October. So what I'm seeing here is just throwing darts at the dartboard, trying to see what sticks. It doesn't seem like they have a clear vision, and the decisions being made are seem to be the decisions of a company that does not have a CEO. So that's what it seems like to me. Let me give you some quick sales numbers here before I forget, just to give you an idea of how big this project was and how many Beatle fans we still had. This album, when it was released, it was the first album to debut at #1. So there was a lot of hype around this. There was a lot of anticipation. It was 3 times platinum after 6 weeks on the market. That's like 3 million copies, I think. That's in the US alone. So it was spent 29 weeks on the Billboard Top 200. Didn't do as well in the UK, reaching only #2. So I don't know what you guys were doing over there, not supporting the Beatles here. But the book went straight to the top of the New York Times bestseller. So this was also a huge success. It doesn't get better than that, folks. So this whole project was a rousing success. Now, one of the things that I wanted to bring up here, because this was such a huge success, is there were several parodies of the anthology. The first one being the Ruddles. They did one called Archaeology, which is classic. Anything the Ruddles does is really, really well done. Weird Al Yankovic parodied the Beatles Anthology in a TV special. He said he had a copy of a fictional Part 17. He had 3 parts here, and that he played it, and Paul McCartney was brushing his teeth, and Ringo Starr was shaving before the Ed Sullivan Show, and all as if we're milking every little bit of sound from back in the day. So I thought that was really, really funny. There was also, Yankovic wanted to do a parody on the song Free as a Bird, and he called it Gee, I'm a Nerd. And he asked permission to do this, and McCartney said, yeah, go for it, but Yoko Ono nixed it. So that's a shame. So Yoko was the wet blanket in this case. Come on, Yoko, where's your sense of humor? Late Night with Conan O'Brien also talking about, releasing John Lennon's old answering machine messages. And even Dana Carvey got into the act, too. So a lot of people were ripping on this because it was seen as scraping the bottom of the barrel. And even George Harrison had mentioned that. He was concerned with that. And I can see their concern, but as you guys, fans like myself and you, I really like listening to a lot of the outtakes and some of that old stuff. It gives it more of an insight to the Beatles as people, to the Beatles as artists, and just to the recording process. And it's not for everybody. It's certainly not for the masses, which this was marketed to. And the masses bought it. But then unfortunately, you saw these things in the used CD stores not long after. So that's why you can get all these rather cheaply. Overall, I know the value the Beatle fans put on this project. It's a very big deal. It was a huge deal at the time. It feels like less of a big deal now, but we still got so much wonderful information out of it. I would say it's an essential part of their history, and it's not perfect, but it sure is pretty. So I thank you for watching. If you want to support this channel in a bigger way, I've got a couple ways below. I've got a Patreon subscription. I've got a way to leave me like a one-time donation, which is a tip jar. I've got some merchandise on my website. And of course, there's the good old-fashioned subscribing, watching a few ads, and sharing and liking. That does way more than you guys think it does. Really helps us YouTubers expand our channels. So I thank you for watching. I'll see you back here on Pop Goes the 60s.